My name is Ted Taylor, and my group project is on the brain. My particular portion is on the four cerebral lobes. The brain is divided into two sections called the cerebral hemispheres, which are connected by neural fibers called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum allows the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. Each hemisphere can be divided into four sections called lobes. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. The first lobe that I want to discuss is the frontal lobe, which is located at the front of the brain and is home to our cognitive thinking. And it is this process that determines and shapes an individual's personalities. In human beings, the frontal lobe reaches its maturity roughly around 25 years of age, which could account for a lot of the stupid and the wild and crazy things that we did, or at least I did, that I probably shouldn't have done. The functions of the frontal lobe include higher learning, reasoning, planning, organizing thoughts, parts of speech, motor skills. The frontal lobe is extremely vulnerable to injury due to its location, as it is the front of the cranium. Any damage to this lobe can lead to many issues, such as increased or decreased problem solving and creativity. It can cause issues with talking habits or increased sexual habits, which could be a good or a bad thing, depending upon your situation. It can reduce your sense of smell. Damage can also make one susceptible to distractions. Next is the parietal lobe, which is located at the top and the back of the brain, just under the parietal bone of the skull. The parietal lobe is responsible for integrating sensory information from the various parts of the body. Functions of the parietal lobe include information processing, perception of stimuli, pain, touch sensation, and cognition. Any damage to the parietal lobes can result in abnormalities on spatial processing and body image. The next lobe that I'm going to discuss is the occipital lobe, which is the smallest of the four lobes. It is located at the back portion of the skull. This area processes visual information from the eyes and the primary visual cortex. Functions of the occipital lobe include visual reception, visual spatial processing, movement, and color recognition. The famed neurologist Oliver Sacks had a patient who had a tumor in his right occipital lobe. While the patient could still see the objects before him and describe them in physical terms, he could not do it by sight alone. Sacks gave his patient a rose to look at, while the patient began to describe it as red in color with a green tube sticking out of it. It was only when he smelled it he was able to recognize it as a rose. Because of its location, it's generally not susceptible to injury, although damage could result in vision loss. Finally, the temporal lobe is just behind the temples. These lobes contain the primary auditory cortex, auditory association area. These lobes also contain the hippocampus, which is responsible for the formation of long-term memory and sorting new information. Damage to the temporal lobe can lead to decreased ability to recall sight and sound, difficulty in recognizing words, and remembering verbal material. In closing, the four cerebral lobes are the occipital lobe, which is the very back of the brain and is the visual center of the brain. The parietal lobe, which is above the occipital lobe, deals with touch, taste, temperature, and body positioning. The temporal lobes on the side of the temples deal with speech and hearing. And lastly, the frontal lobe, which is the last to develop, and again at around age 25, deals with all higher learning and complex decision making. And that's it. That's the four lobes, and good luck on your finals.